Bro, listen.
Never in my life associated the word boring with baseball.
We know what's up.
Me? Yeah. Famous? Yeah.
And I'm like giddy over there smiling like, we're about to win this shit.
Did everyone give you crap? Give me a good host story.
You know, I'm not picking it up.
We both love the game.
We talk about it every day.
Can't get enough baseball.
Having some popcorn, you're fooling around your phone.
I'd have to wait in line for 3 hours.
Hang on, because it's about to be a wild ride.
All right, when I woke up this morning, I said, there's no one I'd rather talk to than Zack Scott. 4Ring Sports, consulting, coaching executives, all of it. I appreciate everything that you do, Zack. I appreciate, by the way, your perspective. I've always appreciated your perspective. First of all, how are you? Good?
I'm good. I'm
right.
doing well.
I've always appreciated your perspective, but I appreciate your perspective on social media, on SNY, on these different platforms, on this coming on here. Because I think you do have a very valuable, unique perspective, which probably for you, and not only for 4Ring Sports, but also just for our perspective of a baseball fan, you must look at him okay, I have seen a lot. I have gone through a lot. I can look at this a little bit differently, maybe even when I was in the middle of it. And it's sort of refreshing. You know what I'm saying? You're coming from such a unique point of view, which I appreciate. I just want to say I appreciate you.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, it's interesting because, I've always been someone that values, I want to be transparent. And that was how I was as an executive with the people that worked for me. And so I'm trying to bring that to the public on social media. I'm sure sometimes I probably say too much, but I don't know. It's hard to know what people are gonna find interesting. I just put what I'm thinking, and hopefully it's interesting. And I do find, even though some of the stuff is very normal to me or typical to me because I've been thinking about it for 20 years, that it can be an interesting perspective for others.
So with that in mind, you go through it. This before it was unique because it was a baseball season, but then it was unique because the team that you were the GM of, the Mets, were in the middle of this run. Part of a good chunk of it you had a responsibility for. What was that like? I've been actually meaning to ask you that because that must have been, I don't know if you were prepared for it, if it hit different. Because again, these players, you acquired.
Yeah, I mean, not very small number of players at this point that I had a direct influence on. Obviously, Lindor being the main player that was brought on when Jared Porter was GM, and then I was the GM when we signed him to that big contract. Yeah, I mean, I still have friends there, so I was watching them and rooting for them. I do, as you mentioned, I do a baseball show and baseball night in New York on SNY, and so we're always talking about the Yankees and Mets, and so it was great for that to be able to keep talking about both of those teams. But the Mets were such a great story, and I live in the area, so it was fun to watch. They were a fun team to watch. There's certain players I especially was happy that Lindor had such a great MVP caliber season, and to see just how he's grown there. Because it was a difficult start for him there, to see how kind of comfortable and confident he looks and how the fans have embraced him. That's really cool. And some other players, some other stories like Vientos, seeing Vientos, who's a prospect when I got there that we loved. And, it seems like later on people were kind of down on him, and to see him get an opportunity and then to make the most of that opportunity is always cool to see.
How many teams tried to trade for Vientos early on? A lot?
No. So Vientos was a player that for me was pretty easy to hold on to. So I came in from Boston to New York thinking pretty highly of him based on kind of how we viewed him at the time. And then I got there, and I think, sometimes this happens with your own players where the people that are kind of closest to it, they focus on kind of the flaws over the big picture of, well, this guy has unique power to all fields. And, if you can, kind of improve in these other areas, he could be an impact player. But industry-wide, I think they were kind of focusing on, well, what's his position? And if he's a first baseman, it's a big difference in value. So he was easy to hold on to because I had him probably higher than a lot of people that had been there. And probably saw him as a top 3 prospect, whereas maybe people in the industry saw him as like a top 7 or 8 prospect. And so you weren't going to have that value mismatch that you often need to have a trade. So it was pretty easy. He came up sometimes, but just not that much.
So you mentioned the postseason. I do want to talk to you about your perspective of the postseason runs in general, because I've actually like taken in the last couple of days, looked at stats compared to other postseason runs and stuff like third time through the order, but relievers having more innings than starters, I think for the first time ever, like those sort of things. But staying with the Mets from their postseason run, when you look at what they did and really what David Stearns had done and what Carlos Mendoza did, and what jumped out to you about what worked for the Mets that allowed them to do what they did?
Well, I think especially down the stretch with the Mets in the last month of the season, their starting pitching was really good. And to your point of, most of the time it's a reliever game in the postseason these days. Like they went into a postseason with actually, they had 5 starters pitching well going in, and obviously you're not going to use all those guys. But I think, that allowed them to put Peterson in the bullpen, which was really helpful for part of it. And then he made a start later. I thought that was a big strength of theirs. And their bullpen, they had some, they were a little thinner there. So I think that was the big reason why they were able to stay in a lot of these games. And then you saw, obviously, against the Dodgers, they weren't able to get, they were walking a lot of guys. They weren't able to get deep into games. And so that kind of changed things for them and why they ultimately got knocked out. But I'd say that was like the big part of what made them good. And then they had, huge moments for, clutch moments offensively. The Alonso homer against the Brewers. I mean, there were some cool things going on, but Vientos was consistently good throughout. But I'd say like the biggest thing that stood out for me going into it was they've actually like one of the few teams that has a real rotation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we talk about the postseason runs, this is one of my biggest takeaways. And Zach, we always know that it's fun to say, okay, who's going to be your starters? The get on my back guys. I'm going to lead us to the promised land. We've seen it many times. The Beckett's, the Lesters, the Blackies, the last year, Montgomery, Evaldi, these guys, and everyone's so obsessed with, well, you have to have the bullpen arms because there's so many bullpen innings. But that's why I kind of thought the Mets were set up, because you have to be able to protect those games where you do need all those bullpens, because I feel like these other teams were just going to like limp to the finish line because they were running out these relievers so much. Conversely, when you look at Manaea or you look at some of these other starters, they're also, you have to make sure they're not running on fumes. I don't know about you. I saw Manaea, I'm like, that guy's done. He's just
done.
When
he was, so there was the controversy with them was why he didn't start in game 1, right? They went with Senga to start. And the reason they didn't was because Manaea wasn't ready to go. He was struggling to recover between starts, which to me was a big red flag that like this guy's hitting the wall and it's bad timing. They had to ride him like they did. And I don't think they overused him. I just think it was a big normal workload and he was good. So we got more innings, but they had to do that to get there. And so, it's not anything they did wrong, but it was a sign clearly that he hit a wall. So it didn't surprise me to see him struggle in his last outing because it was clear he was spent. And sometimes that happens. We had years like that in Boston. I mean, 08 Josh Beckett, compare 07 Josh Beckett to 08 Josh Beckett. Josh was not feeling, had some health issues, was trying to pitch through it. We probably pushed him too hard in some of those games and he gave up some runs late, but sometimes you have those years where those guys just hit a wall. And then there's other times where it seems like it's amazing how they can be as strong as they are throughout the whole run.
And I think that, I've been trying to get my head around lessons learned from this postseason. And one of these is really and you guys, I think, did this back with the Red Sox, build in breaks as much as you can. And Zach, I saw teams where they thought building in breaks was managing pitch counts. No, I'm talking about building in breaks, like building in, because if you think you're going to be a team that gets to October, you can't have what happened. And what's remarkable is the leading innings guy of all the team of the Dodgers and the Yankees was Carlos Rendon, who ended up at like 180 something. That was it.
Yeah.
That was it. Wasn't Zack Gallen at 240 from the year before.
Yeah.
That was it. But I still see teams reluctant to do this. Sometimes you just have it because a guy gets injured and he gets a break.
Yeah.
But we saw so many guys running on fumes heading into this year. I don't know. What's your thoughts on it?
Well, I think, it's an issue that I think comes up a lot is kind of this era, and I don't know how many years to go back to define it as an era, but this kind of max effort era that we're in, right? It's like everything's focused on getting the maximum out of your stuff, throwing your optimal pitch mix. And sometimes doing those things can affect your durability over the long haul. If you're doing things, I mean, I always remember trainers would always tell me, you can handle what your body's trained to do. And so in some cases, they talk about steady workloads for that reason. It's like, well, you can't expect a guy to throw, 120 pitches in a game when he's never done it, or he's only thrown 100 max. Like that's just unreasonable. And that's when you're putting a guy at risk. And I think it's what we train the guys for. And I think we have to set our sights differently when we're asking a lot of pitchers to go max effort. And we see the innings that you just mentioned, the innings totals are lower in some ways. But yeah, I don't know if the right thing is to give them a break. Like we would try to do that. And I think it was, theoretical more than a proven thing where we felt like, okay, let's give them a blow. Usually we'd be somewhere around the All-Star break. We'd kind of use that as a way to structure it. But you got to be careful because then if you shut a guy down or really taper him off, you got to build him back up. And, people, that could cost you some games. And so you got to be careful. But it's always balancing that short-term versus long-term. And it's okay sometimes to take a little step back in the short term if it's going to give you big gains down the road.
But you just made a great point though. And it's like, so I mentioned, okay, Rodon was whatever. He was leading both teams in innings pitched 180 something. But is that 180 something the equivalent of 220, 230 because of exactly what you're talking about? Everything is max effort. Everything is power, 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 power. Should we look at the comparisons to innings or pitches thrown differently now than we did 10 years ago because power is everything, and not only power but torque, and we've gone through all that. Should we look at it differently?
Probably. I can't tell you. I would say yes, but I don't know what the new baseline should be or how to look at it. And it should be an individualized approach, I would imagine. I mean, there are teams internally looking at the pitcher relative to himself and kind of what his norms are, and then whether they're, you talk about stressful innings or stressful outings, and that can be defined in different ways. It could be just a number, like a pure pitch count, or it could be how often were they maxing out their velocity, how often were they maxing out the spin or other things. I know teams have been looking at that more granularly. But yeah, I mean, think back to the beginning of my career where I saw a lot of pitchers, and I was probably spoiled by first year as an intern sitting there watching Kurt Schilling and Pedro Martinez. But the conservation of velocity is something that, like, yeah, Verlander's done that. There's been other guys. You don't see that as much as you used to, like seeing guys hitting max velocity when there's a runner in scoring position type of thing, like Schilling would do all the time. You see that sometimes, but not as often as I used to.
Is there anything else when you look at roster construction or approach the postseason runs that jumped out to you?
Well, I mean, it's fascinating to me. The Dodgers made it look pretty easy in their last, couple series, despite having multiple bullpen games.
Yeah,
that's the thing that stands out is, Arizona last year had multiple bullpen games, and I think that's why they went out and they added a couple starters.
It was a dirty word. I mean, Hazen said this, right? He's like, I shouldn't have a bullpen game,
Yeah. Like he sounded embarrassed that, like, I'm in the World Series and we're having bullpen games. Like, and then there's a team the next year winning the World Series throwing bullpen games. And so, it works for a reason if you have the right arms. I think in some ways, to move fairly quickly through a series is crucial when you're doing that. If you're playing like every series is 7 games, then I think it's harder, or maxing out on your games in every series, because ultimately those workloads catch up to the relievers too. I think you saw that with the Mets actually, with when they were using Diaz prior to the Dodgers series. He was great until he was overworked. And it's going back to the doubleheader against Atlanta through the early part of the postseason. He was really overworked and struggling. And then, not for a reason that was made them happy, but they had some blowouts, so they didn't need him. And then he was really good again. It didn't matter, unfortunately, for them, but the rest is really important for these guys. So I think it's a tough strategy. And as Mike Hazen said, like, it's not ideal. It's not how you draw it up. I don't think that's what the Dodgers wanted to have. They wanted to have a healthy Glass now, a healthy Kershaw. That's not how they designed the team, but it is amazing that you can actually do that.
Yeah, I think that, to your point, I think you can do it, but you have to have the guys to do it, obviously. That it lined up, as the Dodgers people will tell you. There are games where it lined up perfectly, and then obviously games that it didn't. And then you look at how it ended, where you're I don't know if it's the same for you, but I'm looking at that game and how are they going to get to the ninth inning? Like, how are they possibly going to get to the ninth inning? Then Trinan goes 2, Buehler comes in, they save the day. But the optimism after that game, if they didn't win, wasn't because of the bullpen. It was because their best two starting pitchers were going potentially in game 6 and 7. Yamamoto and Buehler are pitching better than they had ever. That comes back to having the starters.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I watched the game the same way.
Yeah.
They got 2+ out of Trinan and then had to go to Buehler. And in a close game, I mean, I agree. If they don't win that game, like, they're putting themselves in a tough spot. But they went for it and it worked. But yeah, I mean, that's how kind of close these things can be. Is like, things could tip very easily when you're using your pitching staff that way. And I'm sure they know that, and that's why they're going for it. And even Roberts, I feel like, was criticized for kind of giving up on some games early. But that's also kind of how you have to manage when you're using all these arms. And you have to be protective of some of them. And so that's why it's odd to win a World Series doing things that way, because it doesn't make sense, and people question it. And I understand why people question it. And it makes it really hard on the manager. That's a hard thing to manage.
So would you, as a GM, look at how this 2024 season played out, including the postseason, and view roster construction any differently?
Not really. I mean, I don't think any differently than how it's been the last few years. I do think the thing that stood out is you need to have, this isn't new. You need to have impact players. I don't want to say the word stars, because there were a ton of stars. I mean, how many future Hall of Famers were in that series? I mean, it's pretty amazing. You might be up to like 8, maybe even more. You'd count GMs and maybe even managers, although I'm sure the fans of bases of those two teams would disagree. But so, yeah, I mean, I think you've always wanted to have impact players. It's hard to find teams that won without impact players. They're few and far between, where you just look at, it's a well-rounded club that won. No, you need to get a lot of value out of a single roster spot so you can have more value in your other roster spots. It's a roster consolidation type of way of constructing your roster.
It's that perfect segue, because that's what I wanted to ask you about. We focus so much now. We're getting into free agent season. The Juan Soto conversation last year was Ohtani. There's plenty of other ones that we look at these teams, and there is the 30,000-foot view is, boy, it really helps when you have those top 3 guys in that lineup and you have to get through them, and then then you have the other guys filtering in. How important is, in your mind, is it to what you said, to find those guys, those whatever you want to call them, stars, pay for certain. I always say pay for perceived certainty. How important it is to allocate resources to get these sort of guys?
Well, I think it's important, like I said before, you want to have impact players. You can get them in a lot of different ways. The certainty piece of it that you mentioned is very expensive, right? Whether you're trading for that player or signing them in free agency. So not every team can do that. You can only go to that well so many times. The Dodgers are maybe the exception that have gone to the well more times than most on these huge contracts. And there are some other teams that could do that, but the Mets stand out as one. But, you can get impact players. Ideally, you're developing your own, because then that's how you can have sustainable window of success, is you have homegrown impact players that you have for 6 years of control. and maybe they're impact players for 4 or 5 of those years. Like the Red Sox have Jarren Duran. Like that's ideal that you get players like that. The problem with that, like everything comes with this different set of risks. So the problem with that is timing, getting all your young prospects to be at their best ability at the major league level at the same time. I remember the Royals, when they got to a World Series or won a World Series, it was one of those things. It's like good for them that they won the World Series, because they had all these young players in the minors that I remember looking at it when they were prospects thinking, how are they going to time this so they come up and play? Because that's a team that has to do it that way, right? They're not going to be spending on Juan Soto, obviously. So the tricky thing is getting it to time it when they're all playing at a peak level at the same time, and it worked out for them that happened, and they got to a World Series, and then they won a World Series. So that's not that normal, though. That's hard. It's hard to place it, space it appropriately. I think we had that. The 2018 Red Sox had a lot of young homegrown impact players, but you can't always do that, and sometimes you have to be a little lucky. I'd say we were lucky that Mookie Betts became that kind of player. We didn't draft him thinking he'd be that kind of player. We thought he'd be a high contact, good defensive shortstop with speed, not a lot of power. Like that's still a good player, and we did a good job drafting to get that player, but he had way more power than we expected, so he became a star player. And sometimes that has to happen for you too. So with the free agents, yeah, if you can, I look at it as, it is the highest risk part of the player pool, right? You're paying top dollar and you're buying typically the decline years of the player. You hope to get as many prime years as you can, and that's what makes a Juan Soto so unique, is that he's only 26 years old. So I kind of look at free agency as, if you have the money, if you're a big market team, you go after those as many prime years of impact talent than you can. So Juan Soto, sure, you're gonna have to buy the back end of his career, but you're going to get so many really good years out of him offensively, in theory, that you go aggressively after those guys and then kind of complement the roster with shorter term deals on the guys that are older.
So the other part is to your point, identifying the guys, right? Identifying, you're going to pay the money for the guys. You're going to say that's the guy. Sure, we might have to eat the last few years of it, but identifying the guys who are going to be the foundation, who are going to take up 15 to 20% of our payroll, whatever it is. That's a tough thing, man. It's a tough thing. And all you have to do is look at the Mookie Betts situation, right?
Yeah.
Like in hindsight, I'll just say, like I say, well, if you're going to say you're going to identify a foundation guy, that's the guy. And then you'll lead to, well, we got to have a foundation guy, so we're going to get Devers. Like if I'm going to pick from those two, I'm picking Mookie. No knock on Devers, he's a great player, but that's the challenge, right?
Right. I mean, at the time with Mookie, the conversation was, if we're ever going to give a huge contract to a player, this is one of how many players that you give it to, and we know him. Like this is the number one guy because we know him so well. He's him. It was like him and Trout as like the two best players in the league at the time. Like if we're in the business of doing these types of contracts, this is the guy we give it to. So the decision was obviously made that this wasn't what we were in the business of doing. Then, of course, it changes, which, like, at the time, to me, it's like, we're not in the business of doing that today. We will be at some point, because that's just how it always works when you're in a big market club, is that things change. And you can say that at one point, but then you'll ultimately feel some pressure to do that. And so Devers, yeah, it's different. Like, he was younger than Mookie, right, when they signed him. So that's the plus to it. But, yeah, he's not Mookie Betts, and he's, Mookie was a platinum glover and defensively.
Was it not to interrupt, but was it?
Yeah.
And I don't know how much I've talked to you about it, but was it just the fact of like Mookie's just asking for too much? Like he's just asking for too much.
No, I think it was. I mean, yes, in the sense, but I think it was just like more 350 million or whatever we thought it might cost. It's just, those are bad deals in general. That was kind of the philosophy of the time, of the moment, which I say because I was there when John Lester. It was the philosophy of the moment that we don't sign pitchers in their 30s beyond a certain number of years, and then we signed David Price. And it's just like, if your philosophies are always changing, do you actually have a philosophy? So
I'm glad you said that. Like,
yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, you want to have some consistency, and it's hard to have a philosophy when you change GMs every 4 years. It is. I mean, but where's the philosophy then coming from? It's obviously it's at the organization level because the organization is bigger than any single GM. And so that's to me is kind of one of the challenges there is everything's a moving target, and so that makes the GM's job really difficult because it's like we may feel this way today, but for what some circumstances may change that we feel like, okay, we have to pivot and be more aggressive. And the philosophies need to be based on kind of really sound thinking and not just kind of, this is how I feel at the moment.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I remember like the John Lester paying the 30-year-old pitchers and everything else, and you go and shock and awe for David Price. But now that's another part of this where we're going into a free agent market where let's say that you need that guy. Like, that you need that guy. You need that guy that we talk about that can go stem to stern, can be the stud in the playoffs and everything else. And like, for instance, a Corbin Burns, okay? Mm-hmm. He's the only guy in the postseason that pitched 8 innings, which is bizarre. Like, there's only one. He pitched an 8-inning game, gave up 1 run. So from your perspective, what is that like? What's that look like? Do you think that that's worth it to identify the guy the pitcher who is going to be a free agent, who can be at the top of the rotation, that you're going to have to eat it maybe at the end, but is it worth it for you to allocate that? Because that is also one of the hardest things to develop too, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's top of the rotation pitchers, especially. It's hard to acquire those guys. Even, a lot of them, it's been a while since I studied this, but a lot of them in the draft, you have to be drafted in the top half of the first round to have access to those guys. It's why we were aggressive in trading for Josh Beckett. And, in his case, it was like, oh, he's 26, like he's young. He was kind of checking a lot of boxes for us, right? But yet to develop John Lester, which a lot of people love John Lester. I don't think we were hoping he could be a top of the rotation, but I don't think we felt, incredibly confident because it's just so hard to do. I would say, to answer your question, I look at roster construction as you need to have balance. You need to be there's other circumstances that dictate when you kind of push the chips in the middle for a particular free agent. And a lot of it is, where are your young players? Because you have to have good young talent ready to contribute at the major league level, because they're going to be making, by the structure of the industry, they're going to be making less than what they're worth. And so if you have enough players making less than what they're worth, then you can afford to take a risk on a free agent who you're probably going to pay more than what you're getting from them over the length of the contract. And so it's really this balancing act between, I hate when people talk about players as assets, but it really is like a portfolio management, right? Like diversifying your risks and all those exciting terms. That's really how you have to think about it. Like, you're taking risks in different ways. If you're betting on a young player, you're taking a different kind of risk. It's not a financial one, so it's safe financially, but it's risky from a performance standpoint. Whereas the free agent is typically safe from a performance standpoint, but high risk on the financials, because typically the high risk is in health, right? As they age, especially when you're talking about pitchers, because pitchers, it's not like they all kind of gradually decline. Some of them will fall off a cliff because of health. The Steven Strasburg case, right? Mm-hmm. So to me, it's all within the context of your roster. And so, yeah, if you're in a place where you have a good young core, or you have good young talent on the cusp,
like Baltimore last year, right?
Yeah, Baltimore's a good example, and I can't speak to their payroll situation or where they're at financially, but yeah, if you're gonna. They went and made a trade for a guy on a 1-year deal. Like, that made a lot of sense for them. Like, that's what they're missing. And now where do they go now that he's a free agent? And so I do think it makes sense for it has to be, let's just not even put a name on the player, because there's issues with individual guys. You do your own research on them and see if they're a fit long-term, that someone you want to bet on as an individual. That's part of it. But then it's, how does it fit in our roster construction, our payroll management over the next, 3 to 5 years or beyond?
Along those lines, I want to ask you, you were there with the Chris Sale trade, which was, we're allocating to the top prospects in baseball for this guy who had made 5 All-Star games, had 2 years left on his contract. and that was the way we're not going to go this way instead of free agency. I don't even know who was available in free agency, but you knew you wanted that player. A guy who was sort of along those lines, but not really, is Garrett Crochet now, right?
Right.
A little bit younger than Sale was, has, as Crochet pointed out to me, in the entirety of his pitching life, college and professional, is just up over 200 innings, like total. Forget about a year. I mean, we're talking about 6 years total,
Right.
but has shown a ton of ability, is 25 years old. How would you view that? How would you view going into, I mean, would you prefer to make a move like that than have some semblance of certainty in free agency with what's available?
Yeah.
You know, I think it's an interesting time this offseason.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends on the acquisition cost, but yeah, in general, I'd rather have kind of the young arm. What's he got? 3 years of control? I think remaining.
2.
Only 2, right? So that's tough. But at the same time, like, he's young, there's upside. Maybe you can extend him. Yeah, I mean, it's tough. To me, a lot of what we were doing was always weighing the financial cost of a free agent and the risk that comes with that, given where they typically are in the aging curve, against the risk of trading away top assets. You know, the Chris Sale, first of all, Chris Sale Crochet's been comped to Chris Sale probably his whole life because he threw. I remember seeing him in college and I was like, oh, that's Chris Sale. And then he gets drafted by the same organization. They bring him up as a reliever first, like they did with Chris Sale. They move him to the rotation. It's very similar paths. And then they may trade him. So with Chris Sale, it was interesting because, again, back to that roster construction, we had just signed David Price the year before, right? So actually, in our conversations, I remember saying, like, okay, if we go big on a free agent, then it makes it really difficult for us if we want to a year from now trade for someone like Chris Sale. I actually said those words because it does, because now what you're doing is compounding your risk to a large degree, right? So now you're trading like 2 top prospects. Now we did a good job of keeping the right guys. You know, they wanted Devers, but we held on to Devers and moved some other guys that made more sense for us. And so that was a great job in kind of trading the right guys who they were useful players, but they weren't the impact that, you know, obviously someone like a Devers was. But I don't know. It's hard. You're always weighing these things against the alternatives. I mean, that's the job. And I think part of it is looking at not just this year, but the next 3 years and kind of where your roster is going to be at and what free agents are going to be out there and what guys might be on the trade market. Because you got to compare with opportunities, right? Because once you make certain decisions, you know, and I think this is where we went wrong at times with the Red Sox, is when we signed big free agents that were the wrong free agents. Like Carl Crawford, like Pablo Sandoval, like Hanley Ramirez. You've taken away, like, there's an opportunity cost too, right? Like, you can't then keep adding. And if the Dodgers didn't bail us out of Gonzalez and Crawford, back at those guys, we were in a lot of trouble probably for a long time. And as you saw, we took then a shorter term approach at first with the 2013 team, and before jumping back into that pool of big free agents. And it's hard. So you're always balancing these things. You only have so many bullets that you can fire. You know, the teams that get in these ruts for a long time tend to be the teams that just push all their chips in the middle. And then you better win when you do that, because if you don't, there's a big cliff.
I always say this. I always admire the executives who understand that you have to get uncomfortable.
Yes.
And I think there's not enough of them. I think that and this is a big problem, I think, in a lot of deals that are or aren't made. How, from your perspective, you probably can see the executives who are willing to do that, and how reluctant are executives now compared to maybe, I don't want old man yelling at clouds, but maybe in the past, to say, hey, listen, we're just going to have to get uncomfortable, but that's the guy I want.
Well, I think, you know, nerds like myself have, you know, ruined the game, right? So we've created this world where a lot of teams have models, these tools, these analytical tools that they use as frameworks for making decisions. And so if you're making a trade or you're signing a player, everyone has a dollar value, or most teams, maybe there's a handful that don't, but in baseball, most teams have these models that will put a dollar value on a player. And so you'll be able to see like what this guy's worth, both your prospects, your major league players, like everyone in your universe. And so then when you're talking to another team about a trade, you're using those things to kind of compare, like what are we getting back? What are we giving up value-wise? Same thing with a free agent. Like how much are we overpaying what our model says he's worth? And I think those tools are good. Obviously, I was part of leading a team that built tools like that, but they need to be used in the right way. And I think sometimes people are so tied to them like they're this exact formula, which they're not. I call them a framework because that's what they are. They're a framework to help you think through it. There's a lot of mental math that you have to do as a general manager making these decisions on how much to offer a guy or how much to offer in a trade. That the job of the analytics group is to provide tools that reduce that amount of mental math. So you don't have to like figure out how much weight do I put on this factor and this factor and this factor. Like that's just too much. No human being is good at doing that. So that's the purpose of these tools. It's to give you some sort of objective anchoring to help you kind of not get emotional, not get too out of control and momentum in a contract negotiation or a trade negotiation, and have something to kind of anchor you to some objective reality. But they're not designed to say this is the guy's value, not a penny more or or a penny less, and stick to that. Or I think what we see a lot of times is, and I encountered this myself in that brief time I sat in that seat with the Mets, is that some teams, they want to win deals, quote unquote, win a trade. And for them, that means getting more value than what they're giving up. Now, if you think about that, that's fine to think of it that way. But ultimately, I guess it's easier to think of it financially. Ultimately, it's like, are you getting impact talent? So like you could do a deal that's a win, quote unquote win on paper, but that the player is just not that good. So if you were signing a player who is like a good role player and you sign him for $7 million and he gives you $10 million of value, yay, you won that deal, but you still got a $10 million player, not a $30 million player. And so like we're in the business of winning, not being the most efficient. Now, efficiency is important, and you need to think about that as you build your roster. And it's especially important for certain teams that don't have the resources. Like if you're in Tampa Bay, you have to be like that because you'd only have so many resources. At some point, though, like even for them or any team in their situation, if you get where you think you're close, it's okay to do a deal that's maybe looks like a loss on paper that kind of gets you over the hump to the next level. Like it's okay to be inefficient at times. And for a big market team, by definition, you're being inefficient, and that's okay. Like if you have a, $300 million payroll, like you're not trying to be efficient. You've declared that to the world that that's not your job. And so it's really about getting the best talent. In the end, you could have a perfectly efficient payroll, but if you have a bunch of average players, you're just going to have an average team.
Man, you scratched right where I itched. That was like, no, honestly, I'm glad you said that. It's like, it's about like identifying the guy that's going to help you win a World Series. The guys are going to help you win a World Series, and within reason, doing what you need to do to get those players.
Yeah, and it's really hard. I only sat in that seat for one trade deadline, and but I've been in the trade deadline room. I had 20. This was my first year not in a trade deadline room for 20 years, and sitting in those rooms and being a part of that my whole career, you're often most of those people in that room don't want to be uncomfortable, to your point, right? Like I always felt like if we got to a place where like a lot of the room was uncomfortable, that's probably a fair deal. Like just I know that's not very scientific, but it always felt that way, where it's like, but the GM often has to be the guy that's saying we're going to do something that like most of the room doesn't want to do. Like, I had to do that with the Mets with the Baez trade, where it's like people in the room didn't want to do it. They weren't like so opposed that like people were like, I'm going to quit if you do this trade. That wasn't like that, but it was like, okay, this is not a good, in rental trades, by the way, no one ever feels good about
No,
because they're not meant to,
but
they're going to always look bad on paper.
But you know what? The Dodgers won a World Series. They made a rental trade.
Yes. And that's the thing is they can help you. And really it's about winning the World Series. I actually think a lot of these models are so focused kind of in a vacuum and based on how they calculate the value of players that you're kind of missing the boat on like, well, what's the value of winning a World Series? Because they're not incorporating that, at least in the ones that I've been privy to seeing. Because I don't know what the answer to that is. I've actually asked some owners that question, and the numbers are pretty huge. And I don't know if that's like franchise value. It's not necessarily operational. Some of it's just revenue that you get, but the numbers are pretty big. And I'm not going to say what they were, but if you're then trading for a rental player that improves your odds, even to look at it in an analytical framework, improves your odds by 5%, or that's a lot, 1%, but 1% of a huge amount of money, that's your expected value of the return, is a huge number. And it's all of a sudden going to turn these negative trades, these rental trades, into neutral or positive trades. And so, it's slippery. You got to be careful with it because you don't want to then turn and make every rental look like a great deal. But there's just different ways of thinking about it, because there is real value in winning a championship that isn't captured by those types of models. And that's okay. Like, again, they're useful. They're very useful tools, and they should be a good starting point to look at, but they're not the end all be all. They're each player has different, there's variations, and any analyst will tell you that. And that's the thing, is like we need to be humble enough to know that the tools that we've created are very useful and position you to make decisions better than you used to be when you didn't have these things. But they're not a formula. They're not a computer. And that's why GMs get paid the big bucks, because it's hard.
That 10 seconds right there summed it up. It was, no, seriously. And you talk about being uncomfortable, and I probably have mentioned this to you. I know I have, and I've cited this example a million times, but I just love it. Back in not this trade deadline, the last one, Chris Young bringing everybody together, saying, "Hey, who thinks we can win the World Series? Because if we do think we can win the World Series, and these are the guys that we're going to have to trade. We're going to have to. Sorry, but we're going to have to trade these guys."
Yeah.
And there was a lot of people like, "Oh, really? We do?" Like, I don't. Do we really? Yes,
Yeah.
That's how it works.
Yeah.
But it's to verbalize that in a room full of people. Like, I think that was just awesome. Everybody should do that. So
yeah, and I was fortunate to be a part of that group with
Yeah.
CY last year, and I was totally aligned with his mindset on that. And it's going to hurt sometimes. And yeah, you could make the case that, well, like, the odds of winning the World Series are so low that you shouldn't do stuff like that. It's like, well, then you'll never do moves.
If there was ever, I think I know an owner who was in the Financial Times who cited those odds. Last thing is GM meetings.
Yes.
I
tomorrow,
like the
right?
GM meetings. This really, nobody cares about this, but from the media perspective, it's great because people are much more relaxed. They're out and about. Everyone's just talking because there's not this urgency of it's the winter meetings and we have to do something. We have to do something. As we know, it's sort of setting the scene for everything else. And Zach, it was actually like a tremendously undercovered thing for media for years. I remember going back to the Dice K posting GM meetings. There was in Boston, which usually has like 20 people there. There was 3, I think. And that one was Dice K Mania, Lugo. Like that was when I think this guy signed Lugo, but there was a lot going on. And once again, people are out there to talk to. So anyway, that's my perspective from the GM meetings that nobody cares about. From the executive's point of view, what's it like?
I think in some ways kind of similar. Like, it's more relaxed because it's so early, right? Like, so the World Series ends, and then you have 5 days till you can start talking to free agents, and then those early calls are typically like, guys aren't coming off the board that quick. So at least like the big fish obviously aren't. So you're placing those calls, expressing interest, so you're kind of getting on their board as a team, registering interest, but there's not a whole lot of action happening. Sometimes you're working on hiring coaches and other things like that. So there's a lot of time to do those things and you're all together. There's also actual meetings, unlike the winter meetings. There's actually a lot of meetings that MLB has with GMs and assistant GMs. There's some arbitration related stuff typically, and I don't know if it's changed. It's been a while since I've been, and so I'm assuming that's still the same. They'll go over some rule changes. I'm sure they'll be talking about what Rob, the commissioner, was talking about recently, the challenge system of the strike challenge system, how they're gonna kind of roll that out. Sure, they'll be talking about that. There's some votes taken on certain changes, how to get a sense of how people feel. To have breakout sessions with different subsets of leaders from different teams to talk about different issues with someone from MLB in every room to kind of gather that information and just get the feedback. So there's opportunities to have those kind of conversations. And then, yeah, you're in meetings most, they'll like the early afternoon or maybe like 2:00. And then, you can have dinner with your crew. You're having those phone calls with other teams, check-ins, maybe laying the foundation of trades. There's probably more trade conversations happening than free agent related conversations. So, I enjoyed it. It didn't have the same kind of circus atmosphere that the winter meetings can have. And I think, even the winter meetings have become a thing where less action happens at the winter meetings than it used to. But you still probably don't get access, to your point, get to talk to a lot of people because most of them
they're in
their
suites, right?
And they don't necessarily want to come out because there's so many media people there. There's so many job seekers there. There's so many other people that are going to stop them. And so a lot of people just lock themselves in the suite, which isn't the healthiest choice, but I understand it.
Well, the Dodgers were in an entirely different hotel last year. It's like that's the next level.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of this, even in the winter meetings, is we get to see everybody. I think in the GM meetings, we get to see the other GMs, president, baseball operations, assistant GMs. We get to see everybody. And meanwhile, you meet with the agents. And I would imagine those meetings with the agents are like, we want $1 trillion. What do you think?
Right. The buy it now prices.
Yeah. So, well, you've taken a lot of time. I appreciate it, and always awesome. So keep up the good work. And
thanks, Rob.
We
Always
value
fun.
we value you and your perspective and continuously the good work. So thanks, man.
Appreciate it, Rob. Take care.